Our guest today, Barbara Lochbihler, is a German politician. She served as a member of the European Parliament for 10 years and is part of the European Green Party. After becoming a member of Parliament, Lochbihler served on the Subcommittee on Human Rights and was its president since 2011 until 2014. She was also a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Parliamentary Delegation for Relations with Southeast Asian countries. In its parliamentary group Green Alliance in Europe, Lochbihler also served as a spokesperson for human rights and foreign policy. In the year 2016, announced her retirement from active politics. Based on her human rights experience, Barbara Lochbihler will speak to us about the current confrontation between Russia and Ukraine. This and much more in the Agora, a meeting place. Good morning, friends from the Agora. Welcome to our program. From Berlin, Barbara Lochbihler, A Vision of the War. Barbara, welcome to our program. It's a real pleasure to have you with us in El Agora. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Angela Dolmetsch. It's a wonderful occasion to see you again, I think after 27 years. And when we met the last time, we were together on a peace train starting from Finland, going to the World Conference on Women in 1995 in Beijing. And while my memories are there on these very exciting times, we went through Russia, through St. Petersburg, and also through the Ukraine to Odessa. And while we have just since a week a war of aggression of the Putin government against the people of the Ukraine, my memories are there, and I'm really very sad and see the suffering of the women, children, and the whole society in Ukraine. But I also think of the women we met in St. Petersburg and their vision of a future Russia and their vision of peace and security. And I'm very I'm very touched when I hear that again, the mothers of the soldiers from Russia, the soldiers' mothers, an organization we met in 1992, are still now on the streets and very brave because repression is very high against them. They say, we want to solve conflicts we have in a peaceful way. And so I think even 30 years later, the world is not a more peaceful place. And particularly now in Europe, we see that a government like the Putin government opts for a really war of aggression against another state, which the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, my organization, is completely opposed to. And we demand actually that again, the war has to stop and people have to negotiate, and not also what we had a decision in Germany last Sunday to invest more in armament, to invest more in our military, to be better equipped. We still, since 30 years ago, we say that with more arms you will not create more peace, you will create more insecurity. So at the moment we have a very lively debate in the German societies where we should move on. Of course, we have to try to stop the Russians, but just by doing it with more arms, it will not help.
Barbara, 27 years ago, when we went to Kiev, I remember that there were these women from Ukraine who actually got in the peace train, and they complained that they couldn't afford to buy contraceptives, and therefore they have to have abortions, and they have 7 or 8 abortions, some of them. How do you see Ukraine nowadays?
Well, at the meeting in Kiev, we discussed a lot of health issues caused by nuclear radiation coming from Chernobyl. But the woman who organized this for us, Nina Karpacheva, she was the first member in the Ukrainian parliament at that time who also discussed violence against women in the private sphere. And I think nowadays it is, of course, much easier to have access on contraception. I think that's not so much the problem in the Ukraine. But still, the problem of the whole country is before the war, there's a huge gap between very poor people and very rich people. But there is not so much influence of religious groups who don't allow people to ban the use of contraception. So that is much easier. And you see the women in the Ukraine, and I visited Ukraine 4 years ago when we were discussing in the parliament there that they should join the International Criminal Court to deal with war crimes, which they haven't done yet, only to a certain amount. And at that time, the women I met, they are quite educated, but still feel a lot of insecurity in the country also by political unrest. And of course, violence against women in the homes is also a relevant and very widespread issue, as in others of our European countries.
Barbara, do you think that now the regime in Ukraine has changed, because apparently they have a new, this president is not part of the corrupt system, but it is a comedian, and as we have seen, he seems to be a very good person. He doesn't seem to be the sort of people that have governed Ukraine before.
Well, the current president won the elections with 70% of the votes, and he is from a small group of parties which are not the old oligarchs or the old groups. So the people voted for him because he promised to get rid of corruption. Unfortunately, I think there is still a lot of corruption. But now, for example, the discussion if the Ukraine can join the European Union has a lot to do with that you have your administrations correct, and corruption hinders this. But now, in the situation of this aggression from Russia, I think the president performs very well. He seems he is brave, he is not leaving the country, and he stays with his people and defends as much as he can.
That is a very interesting way of looking at it, and especially for people who can see it from Europe itself. We are going to make a pause now, and we come back in a few minutes. We continue in our program, Barbara Lochbihler from Berlin, A Look to the War. Barbara, you as an ex-member of the European Parliament, why do you think Russia continues to be away or is not part, and it hasn't really become part of Europe?
Well, geographically, Russia is, of course, part of Russia before the Ural Mountains is part of Europe. And Russia as a state is also a member of the Council of Europe. But Russia is not a member of the European Union. And the European Union, it's basically the old West Europe, when there was still the Socialist Bloc and the West Bloc, and members who, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, joined the European Union, like Romania and so on. And Russia is far too big, I would say. But I have to say that Russia is the dominant regional power in Europe. And all the developments have to be a common development, because I think, like the people in the Ukraine, they would like to have open structures in their governments, have a kind of open societies with democratic votes. And I think people in Russia do have the same. But the power structures in Russia, they have not changed very often. And so I think with this very terrible, really terrible war of aggression, it will be is much more difficult for the society of the Russian society to live in an open way, having different freedoms, like independent media is cut down. More and more independent non-governmental organizations are all being called how can I say, foreign agents laws, which is not true. So there are big steps backward within the Russia society.
Russia is, as you say, is a big country, but Russia is also a capitalist country now. There's no reason for having this division because there are very big capitals in Russia. They also, I mean, you see Russian investment everywhere in Europe, in the world. I mean, the Russian oligarchs buy properties in Spain, everywhere. And so why is it that it is not easy to incorporate Russia as part of Europe?
Well, so first, there is no debate because Russia has not asked to join the European Union. It is much bigger. The size and the how the country is organized. It's not only that they have a kind of a market economy, which they have, but they have not applied. For them, the European Union perhaps is also too small. But of course, there are a lot of ties on trade with the European Union. And because of political problems and critique how they run the state, the European Union had put sanctions, like, for example, it's more difficult since years now to export agricultural products from West Europe or from Germany to Russia. And now with the increase of sanctions, very strict sanctions, it will be very difficult for Russian goods to come to the European market. And with after the war now, the war situation, the sanctions of the European Union, they mean for the German and European countries that they should cut and stop their business with producing either in Russia or having trade with Russia. So the situation after this war of aggression is bringing Russia and the European Union much further apart. So I regret this, but it seems there is no other way to signal to and give a strong signal to the Russian government. They cannot continue by putting their national sovereignty above everything, even above the prohibition to start a war against the other country. But as I said at the beginning, Russia has never in the past asked the European Union to join. They have been in the Council of Europe. There are countries including Canada, the United States. It's always seen it's from Quebec to Vladivostok. This is a huge region. They discuss human rights. They have discussed peace negotiations, such issues, but certainly have not the economic power as the European Union.
The Council of Europe is a group of people that join together for trade reasons, for economic reasons, or it is also that has to do with security?
Well, the European Union, when it started, was a peace project, I would say, because a country like France reached out to a country, Germany, my country, which brought a lot of war, crimes, destruction to Europe. And to overcome nationalism, and for us in Germany, the government, it was very important that France and other European countries reached out their hand and says, let's work together, that we never will fight each other. It was the West Europe. After this, then it developed much more into an economic union. So we have fewer borders in between us, and that is really a strong economic project. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, countries like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania and Bulgaria, a little later, they all joined the European Union, because for them, the way of a social market economy, the way of a democratic structure was more a project of freedom, less so a model for peace. And most, not all, but most of the European Union member states are also members of NATO. So NATO actually is the military strong alliance here, of course, dominated by the United States. And I think that was also the cause where Russia rightly said that a lot of NATO troops moved too close to the Russian border. And this was not explicitly wanted by Russia. And this has to be corrected long ago from NATO side, but now it is no reason at all to come for this argument to start a war against the Ukraine. And unfortunately now, many of the European Union states will increase their military budget to become military stronger. But I think this is the wrong way to go. The European Union should continue to be a union who has strong ties on trade and economy and diplomacy and political strength and reaching out to neighboring countries, but not going to become a military unit.
It looks as though the agreements that were made not to have wars anymore and are being finished somehow. Somehow they are not being kept anymore. We are going to have a short pause and we come back with you. We continue with the Agora. Barbara Lochbihler from Berlin, a look at the war from Europe. Barbara, how would you say you work with human rights? What sort of opinion or what is going to happen with human rights as they are being violated in this war?
Well, first, I think even a state acts like the Russian government now, attacking another state. They don't do this in a lawless situation. So they have really to follow the protection which are under humanitarian law. There are rules also in terms of warfare. And I think from outside we can have satellite pictures, we can have investigations as much as we have witnesses from inside to have documentations if the fighting is attacking civilians, and which is usually in war. So we can always appeal, they should not attack civilians, but we can see usually after the war what has happened. And then this has to be documented and has been brought to the respective courts. So still we will see what is the end of the war, who will be in the government and what are the regional institutions. And at the beginning of this week, the International Criminal Court in Den Haag, who deals with war crimes and crimes against humanity, they have opened investigations, and they can do this because the Ukraine, since 2014, after the annexation of the Crimea, can look into war crimes and crimes against humanity. So from this side, there for sure will be an investigation. Then we still have, as I said, technical opportunities from satellite pictures, from individual documentations from people who are inside the country to see which army unit did what on the ground. Then you can reconstruct who gave the order and what kind of orders. So this doesn't the human rights protection at the moment when there is a war, of course, people are unprotected. But those who commit the crimes, they can be held accountable. Fortunately, we have a situation where, in the case of the Ukraine, the neighboring countries like Poland, the European Union countries, they have opened their border to shelter and take refugees and people coming from Europe, which was not always the case. Europe had a lot of human rights violations against people, refugees who came to its borders, like on the Mediterranean, people from Syria, they were not welcomed. But what we can see now is that the European Union has given permission that people looking for protection from the Ukraine can come here for 1 year. And this includes also people who are foreigners who study and be refugees in the Ukraine, for example. They all can come, they can have access to the European Union, and they can stay for as long as 1 year, and also have some permission to work, but also have some social support. So that is fine. And you have seen the international community, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This week also they had a special session, and Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, has appealed to Russia to not attack the civilians there and not to opt for war, but they neglected this. They deny, they say they will only destruct military facilities, but they don't do this. This is what we can see already when they conquer cities. And yesterday, but this was not only a human rights resolution, but the appeal for strong human rights protection is part of the General Assembly resolution, which was adopted yesterday, where 148 states condemned this war as a war of aggression. And we don't live in a lawless and a rule of law situation where a state can do what they want. I think the international community, organized in the United Nations, they have clearly said, stop this war. This is against all rules we have. If we don't respect that one country cannot attack the other because of the might of being able to attack, we will go back to the Middle Ages, and this is a big step backward. And it is a good sign that the General Assembly and the world community said, no, stop it, we don't back you. There are only 5 states who are on the side of Russia. It is Syria, it is Eritrea, and 2 other states who also, North Korea, they really don't respect international law.
This United Nations order or this human rights requests to Russia, what happens if Russia doesn't obey them? I mean, can they be held accountable while there is a war, or they have to wait until all the destruction goes on?
So far, they have not opted for a military intervention, which I personally think is right. I think it is good that there are a lot of sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia, on the foreign minister and on Putin himself, but also against a lot of very rich oligarchs. And there are severe sanctions who will hit the Russian economy and will isolate actually economic actors in Russia. So I assume that the Russian population at large, not only some in urban cities, will see the economic consequences. And this will also lead to a change in the government of Russia. But as I said, on individual war crimes committed during this war, people within the army and those who give commands, they can be held accountable after the war. We can see this. We have also in Germany now 2 Syrian war criminals who faced charges on German courts. So the international community is quite helpless in the current situation because nobody invades the Ukraine to fight there. But the sanctions are pretty strong, and I think also the European Union sticks together in this case to speak with one voice, which hopefully will continue when they speak after the fighting stops and negotiations again with Russia will continue. And then there, human rights have to be on the agenda.
Do you think, Barbara, that in this very complicated situation, do you think that there is a possibility of a third world war?
Well, I don't hope and I don't think so, but I am also not sure in the long run, because the Russian Putin government has said maybe there is an option for a nuclear warfare. And if other states who have access to nuclear weapons start discussing this again in their military logic, which leads to insecurity, not to security, then there is a danger. But so far, I have not heard this. And also, I think the international community, with this resolution at the UN opposing this war of aggression, gave a clear signal that they don't want to go back to a lawless time. They want a rules-based world. And this means that those governments who attack another government, they will be punished for. And there are only losers in the Third World War. Nobody will win.
Thank you very much, Barbara. We hope that this is not going to happen, that there is not going to be a third world war, and that those people who are thinking that they can win again by having a war which we don't want, they won't do it. Thank you so much for accompanying us in our program.
Thank you very much for having me.